Today we want to talk about not being a stumbling block. I mentioned last time that we would focus on that today, and I want us to get an idea of what it even means to be a stumbling block. As a reminder, last time we talked about how we are made in the image of God, but that means that others are also made in the image of God. And so they are his children as we are his children, and he does not want us causing problems for them in their relationship with him. When we talk about the idea of being a stumbling block, we can get that idea from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 14, where the law of Moses said, "You shall not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but shall fear your God. I am the Lord." The idea here is that there were people who would do things to the disabled when they knew they wouldn't get caught by that person for it, which was, that we know that is not the way that God wants us to treat someone else. Here, there's someone who's blind walking down the road, and you put something in front of them that they will trip over, they will stumble over. It's a stumbling block. And so when we talk about the idea of a stumbling block, we're talking about placing something in the way that someone might trip over spiritually, that they may not be prepared to deal with properly, and it can cause a problem in their spiritual life. I want us to first just get this out of the way, that Jesus is a stumbling block or a stumbling stone in a way. In Romans chapter 9, in verse 30 through 33, it says, "What shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained to righteousness, even the righteousness of faith. But Israel, pursuing the law of righteousness, has not attained to the law of righteousness." Why? Because they did not seek it by faith, but as it were by the works of the law. For they stumbled at that stumbling stone. As it is written, "Behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone and a rock of offense, and whoever believes on him will not be put to shame." And there are several passages that refer to this quotation. But the idea is that Jesus is a stumbling stone or a stumbling block for those who do not seek righteousness by faith. He is not someone who does things the way that man thinks it should be done. We have to change our thinking to be like him. And if we don't do that, we are going to trip over him. But it's not causing sin in this case. This is the sinner not coming to God properly because of a fault in themselves. In 1 Peter 2, verse 7 through 8, it says, "Therefore to you who believe, he is precious. But to those who are disobedient, the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling, and a rock of offense. They stumble, being disobedient to the word to which they were also appointed." So he says there's the difference between those who believe and those who are disobedient. Also, obviously, those who do not believe are those that are disobedient here. So for those who do not believe, Jesus is a stumbling stone. But what we want to talk about is a little bit different from that. So there's a difference between stumbling stones for those who believe and for those who do not believe. Those who do not believe stumble over the truth, but we are going to talk today about being a stumbling stone for those who believe. All right, so Matthew chapter 18, in verses 1 through 7, it says, "At that time the disciples came to Jesus, saying, 'Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?' Then Jesus called a little child to him, set him in the midst of them, and said, 'Assuredly I say to you, Unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of offenses, for offenses must come, but woe to that man by whom the offense comes. Here in the New King James, we see this word offense. Other translations often will have stumbling stone here. It's the same idea, the same word that is behind it. And the idea of that word is something that causes sin. And you can see that there in verse 6. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin. And you can see how bad that is. He says it would be better to be drowned in the sea than to cause someone to sin. Offenses must come. There's always going to be those who are putting stumbling stones in other people's way, or being that stumbling stone. But woe to that man by whom the offense comes. We need to make sure that we are not doing this. I want us to really get the point here from what Jesus says, first of all, that you can cause someone else to sin. There are people today who simply deny that, at least in various areas of life. I've seen that a lot lately, which is why I'm talking about that today. And we're going to look at a particular illustration of that later. But I want us to really see that Jesus is saying it is possible to cause someone else to sin. This doesn't mean that they are not responsible. If they sin, obviously they are responsible for it. If they were not responsible, then it would not be sin. But you can still cause someone else to sin. In Matthew 13, verse 40 through 42, at the end of a parable that Jesus tells here, it says, "Therefore, as the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of this age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and those who practice lawlessness, and will cast them into the furnace of fire. There will be wailing and gnashing of teeth." This idea, again, of offending is, that word there is the idea of causes to sin, or a stumbling block. And other translations have that idea in there. And so he says, at the end of time, at the judgment day, if you are a stumbling block, if you are causing other people to sin, that is sin, and you will be cast into hell as on that basis. We do not want to be causing others to sin or being stumbling blocks in their relationship with our Father, any more than we want anything interfering with our relationship with our Father. So how can we be a stumbling block, or how can I be a stumbling block? Well, you can be a stumbling block even if the person does not stumble, first of all. And that may sound a little bit strange, but just because someone doesn't actually commit sin does not mean that you are not pushing them in that direction and actually being a stumbling block for them. We see this in the case of Jesus and Peter. In Matthew chapter 16 and verse 21 through 23, it says, "From that time, Jesus began to show to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised the third day. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, 'Far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you.' But he turned and said to Peter, 'Get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me. for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men. Jesus does not sin, but he tells Peter, you are an offense to me. You are a stumbling block to me. Well, how was he a stumbling block? Because what he was saying was not based on the thinking of God. It was based on the thinking of men. You can be a stumbling block by saying things that are focused on worldly thinking rather than on God's thinking. Again, that's the whole point of this series, is learning to think God's way. If we don't learn to think God's way, then we can end up being stumbling blocks for others, as well as having sin in our own life, because we don't know how to think properly. We need to make sure that we think the way God thinks, so that we can have that right relationship with him for ourselves, but also so that we can say the things that are helpful to those around us in their thinking along those lines as well. In Revelation chapter 2, verse 14, Jesus says to one of the churches, but I have a few things against you, because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality. So if you remember the story of Balaam, we mostly remember that the talking donkey, that God made his donkey talk to him when he was on the way to see the king of Moab, whose name was Balak. And Balak wanted Balaam to curse the children of Israel when they were on their way to the land of Canaan, and God would not allow Balaam to curse them, but rather gave them a blessing instead. But Balaam knew how to get God to curse the children of Israel, and so he taught Balak to send women into the camp to commit fornication with them and get them to eat things sacrificed to idols. And God ended up killing many of the Israelites as a result. And Balaam didn't do any of that, did he? He did not eat things sacrificed to idols, as far as we know. He didn't commit sexual immorality, as far as we know. He simply taught someone else to get others to do that. And yet he was killed as a result of this sin of putting a stumbling block, or teaching others to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel. It's a serious matter when we teach things, or when we talk to people about anything related to the will of God. We must make sure we are directing them in the right direction, not towards sin. You can also be a stumbling block by putting some sort of temptation to sin in front of them. So we see that with this example of the women going into the camp and getting the men to commit fornication. And while the men were absolutely to blame for committing fornication, God very clearly also blames those women and those who sent them in. All of the people involved in that were to blame, not only the ones who committed fornication with them. So we need to realize that there is such a thing as a stumbling block, and you can be that way. You can put temptation in front of someone and cause them to sin. And you are responsible for that. You will be held responsible by Christ. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8, he talks about eating meat sacrificed to idols. And in verse 7 through 13, he talks about, before this, he talked about how we know that there's no such thing as an idol, that there's no God except for the one God that we worship. And so since these idols are nothing, right, it's fine to eat the meat sacrificed to them. That was the reasoning some of the Christians were giving. And so he says in verse 7, however, there is not in everyone that knowledge. For some with consciousness of the idol until now eat it as a thing offered to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. But food does not commend us to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, nor if we do not eat are we the worse. But beware lest somehow this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to those who are weak. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will not the conscience of him who is weak be emboldened to eat those things offered to idols? And because of your knowledge shall the weak brother perish, for whom Christ died? But when you thus sin against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never again eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. This is a really important idea, that Christ died for our brethren, not just for us. And so we must live in a way that is not going to lead them into sin, even if it's something we believe we have the right to do, that it is not sinful, but they believe it is. Or they believe that they're doing something that would be sinful, such as worshiping an idol as they eat this meat. And he says, if you're exercising this liberty, you're eating that meat because you say, no, it's fine. I understand that this is not worshiping an idol. I'm just eating meat. But you become a stumbling block to those who are weak. And he says, the attitude we should have is that if it's going to make my brother stumble, I will never do it. It doesn't matter that I think I have a right to do it. That makes no difference. If it's causing a problem for my brother or my sister, and they're stumbling into sin, then I don't want any part of that. It is serious to be a stumbling block, and we do not want any part of that. So you can be a stumbling block to someone by doing things that are permitted by God, but are not permitted by their conscience. So it may be that it's something that is okay in itself, and yet that doesn't mean that it's actually okay for you to do it, because you may be sinning against them and therefore sinning against Christ. Take into consideration how others view what you are doing. In Romans 14 and verse 13 through 23, we read this verse 13 last time. And he says, therefore, let us not judge one another anymore, but rather resolve this, not to put a stumbling block or a cause to fall in our brother's way. I know and am convinced by the Lord Jesus that there is nothing unclean of itself, but to him who considers anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean. And there he's talking about food generally in the context here. And you see that in verse 15. Yet if your brother is grieved because of your food, you are no longer walking in love. Do not destroy with your food the one for whom Christ died. And so this whole passage is very important, but let's jump down to verse 19. Therefore, let us pursue the things which make for peace and the things by which one may edify one another. Do not destroy the work of God for the sake of food. All things indeed are pure, but it is evil for the man who eats with offense. It is good neither to eat meat, nor drink wine, nor do anything by which your brother stumbles or is offended or is made weak. So we need to make sure, if we know that what we are doing is a problem for a brother or a sister in Christ, and it's not something that we know God really wants us to do. It's just something we believe we have the liberty to do. Leave it off. Don't do it. Don't cause a problem. Do not eat with offense. Do not put anything in the way of your brother where he can stumble over it and have a problem. That's not walking in love. So resolve not to put a stumbling block or a cause to fall in your brother's way. And the example, I know I'm running short on time, I apologize, but we can show too much of our body sometimes. And we could say, well, the Bible may not be super clear about that. I think it's fairly clear, but others don't. And so what about that? If you show too much of your body and someone lusts after you, is that your fault or theirs? Well, of course, in Matthew 5, verse 27 through 29, Jesus doesn't blame the woman here. He doesn't even talk about how she's dressed, right? He just says, if you look at her with lust, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart. But it's clearly something based on the eye, isn't it? Verse 29, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. So there the focus is on the one doing the lusting. It's clearly his fault, absolutely. And yet, that doesn't mean that it is not the other person's fault as well. Who's to blame if a man lusts after a woman or a woman lusts after a man when they're showing off their body or behaving in a seductive way? You can say, well, I didn't cause them, I didn't force them to think those thoughts. And this is what some people have been saying in the past months. I've seen a number of people posting things like this. It's the man's problem. Nobody's forcing him to sin. And really, those are the words of Satan, as he loves to speak half-truths, that it is the man's problem. Nobody is forcing him to sin. That is actually true, but that's not the full truth. It's always the fault of the one who sins. It wouldn't be sin otherwise. But the one who put the stumbling block in the way of their brother will also be judged. If you know something's a problem and you do it anyway, you're not walking in love, and you are sinning against your brother and sinning against Christ. That's just an example, but we can apply that to all kinds of things in life. So don't buy into the lie that you cannot cause someone else to sin. That's really the whole point of Jesus teaching about stumbling blocks. But don't use that as an excuse for your sin. Don't say, oh, they're a stumbling block to me. Well, you're still going to be judged for what you do. But just resolve not to put a stumbling block in the way of your brother or your sister, and make sure you're walking in love. And be aware of what those around you find to be questionable or wrong, and avoid it. And in doing this, you'll serve them, and you'll be a good servant of Christ. Let's make sure we don't put a stumbling block in our brother's way. Thank you.